In this presentation, we're going to have a quick update on standards and grading, and also as well look at the activities that we've been doing in Work Package 1. So there are a number of grading standards committees that we are active on at the CEN level, TC 124, Technical Committee 124, particularly Working Group 1, which is the one that looks after test standards, Working Group 2, which is the one that looks after structural timber, that's sawn timber rather than glulam or crosslam, and Working Group 2 TG1, Task Group 1, which is the task group for approving new grading machines and grading machine settings and the visual grading assignments, and that's the one that I'm convener of. We're also active on the Mirror Committee for British Standards, which is B518, which is the one that looks after structural timber plus glulam, CLT, plus light timber frame, plus fasters and all sorts of things like that. And then there is the UK Timber Grading Committee, which is really industry-led committee, which complements the work of the British Standards Committee and feeds into the CEN committee work. So there's not that much happening at the moment. Obviously the pandemic has affected the way that standards committees operate. Working Group 2 of CEN TC 124 was supposed to have a meeting, but that got postponed. But the other committees have been meeting online. The current issues are around the continued non-citation of EN 14081 Part 1, which is the harmonised standard for graded structural timber. That still hasn't been cited since it was first updated in 2016, which means effectively that it's not the harmonised standard. The harmonised standard is the previous withdrawn version of that standard, withdrawn quite a long time ago now. Now, this is down to issues that really don't have a lot to do with wood or that particular standard. It's a general issue to do with harmonised standards, especially ones to do with the construction products regulation. And it comes from consequences of some legal cases in Europe. Far too boring and complicated to go into here. There are a couple of blog posts if you want to get into more details of this. But essentially, the problem is that standards are supposed to be voluntary. They're supposed to help you with complying with European regulations, but they started to be treated as being more like a kind of law than a standard. So it was becoming necessary that you had to follow the standards, and therefore the standards become somehow part of European law, which then carries with it also lots of other things around legal certainty. So the standards having to have very specific cross-references to certain other versions of the standards, so no undated references, and no cross-references to standards that have been withdrawn. Now, that's very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve with real standards, because there are so many cross-references, and standards are written by different committees and have different, they're updated on different schedules. So there's no way that you can keep a vast network of standards and cross-references completely up to date. So this is an issue, and CEN recognises it as an issue, and no one quite knows what to do about it. One of the things that recently happened was that what was supposed to be the harmonised standard for cross-laminated timber, they removed the part of the standard that would have made it a harmonised standard and submitted it for assessment as a normal standard, to allow industry to use that standard for CLT, because there hadn't been a previous one that had been harmonised. So it's a real problem, because it's stopping development in standards. A lot of work is done in improving the standards, and then they end up not being no one able to use them. So that's one issue, and no one is quite sure where that's going to go. We in the committee, we think we fixed most of the issues to do with EN 1401 that the European Commission had raised, but we still have this problem of data references and legal certainty, which seem at the present moment seem unsolvable. So we don't know really what's going to happen there. Other big piece of work that we're doing is a revision of EN 1912, which is the standard that contains some but not all of the visual grading assignments for structural timber. That's a piece of work that I've been doing, building a database of all of these assignments. There have been a lot that were approved by TG1 recently, and also some ones that were approved by TG1 in the past, and people forgot to put them in the new version of EN 1912. So there's a piece of work that needed to be done to collect all of these assignments, make sure that everything is correct, and make sure that nothing is missing. There are also some issues to do with tightening up the species names and the descriptions of growth areas, and you can look at the blog if you want to get the details on that. Not so many implications for homegrown timber, apart from ones that I will mention in a moment. But we do import a lot of visually graded timber, so this is an important standard for UK importers. There are some minor updates in other standards to do with fixing some editorial issues and some interpretations, and there is some early work going on in revising EN 408, which is the main testing standard that we use. No big changes in it, but it is not a very well written standard for the users of it. So we're improving the sequence of it and improving the wording so that actually it literally says what we want it to say, so there's no longer any need to interpret it in certain ways for certain uses. So no big changes, but we want to make sure that it's a good usable standard for the people that use it, which are people like us and the equivalent of us in other European countries. Now, Brexit is obviously a big issue. There's an awful lot of things that the industry needs to be aware of and needs to prepare, and I'm certainly not the expert on that, and I'm not going to be able to say that much about it, but the TTF has a very good guide for the timber industry, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at their website if you've not already done so. And hopefully Nick Bolton will be joining the webinar, so if you have any particular questions, if anyone knows the answer, it will be Nick, I'm sure. But I want to touch on a couple of issues to do with the grading and the marking. So we would be used to CE marking. That's what we have been doing and what we can continue to do for the next year with some minor changes. But after that, there will be the UK CE mark and the CE UK NI mark. I will try and guide you through the implications of those. So if you have a construction product with a harmonized standard, there will be no big changes for next year, hopefully, except that instead of being able to use a UK-based notified body together with the harmonized standard to get your CE mark, you'll need to use an EU-based notified body, which could be the same notified body in effect, but with their guys in the European office. I'm sure you all know about this because we've been preparing for it for a while. But yes, you need an EU-based notified body to continue to do the CE marking, and CE marking will be required to sell products onto the European market for the foreseeable future. Now, after the end of next year, in Great Britain, by which I mean Scotland, England and Wales, they say that CE marking will no longer be acceptable, and you have to use the UKCA mark instead. And that means a approved body instead of a notified body, and a designated standard instead of a harmonized standard. Now, hopefully, those systems are completely parallel. You still need to have two separate approvals for your product, which is annoying. But hopefully the same standard will be a harmonized standard as is a designated standard. So that shouldn't create too many problems, and you will be able to dual mark your product for sale on the UK market and onto the European market, or to do the same process and market one or the other for the different markets. But there is potential for this to go wrong accidentally, if not deliberately, with the versions of standards that are declared to be the harmonised one or the designated one. And as I've already explained, the European harmonised standard system is in a real mess already. So not quite sure whether we can copy that mess exactly across into the British system. Let's hope that we can. And there might be some minor issues to do with the way that, even if the standards are the same, the way that certain clauses and certain cross-references are interpreted by the notified body differently from the approved body. Although hopefully, because it will probably be the same people with different hats on, the notified bodies and the approved bodies will have the same interpretation on how to use the standard. So you can have the same production system and be able to mark one or the other. So the one thing that is less certain is what happens with Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, because it's going to be, we think, part of the European market, it will be required to continue to do CE marking in Northern Ireland. But because you might want to do that CE marking with a UK-based notified body, there is this additional mark, a UK NI mark, which allows you to put a CE mark on your product and make it suitable for the Northern Irish market, but not suitable for European market. So you're following the European system, but you happen to have a UK-based notified body instead of an EU-based notified body. So some news from the Wood Props project. As I say, this is led by NUI Galway in Ireland and partnered with us at Edinburgh Napier. One of the things that they've been doing is looking at long-term trends in spruce timber quality, and that's something that I will briefly bring up later on in this presentation, because I think the data is really interesting. And as I mentioned, they've been looking at larch and Douglas fir measurements, and their work has compared with our work and been able to get the grading settings updated and approved for those two species. And they've been looking at Scots pine, and the work that they've done with Scots pine will also go towards potentially new grading work, new grading approvals for Scots pine. They've been looking at secondary timber properties, particularly tension strength of spruce. This was something that got reduced in an edit of one of the standards, and it's a small data set that NUI have been able to do because tension testing is difficult, but it looks like the timber is better than the standard currently says that it is. And that's an important conclusion for products like glulam, because glulam performance is governed by tension strength. There are some other secondary properties that we want to look at, but it was interesting to confirm what we thought, that the standard editing process had unfairly reduced the tension strength of our resource. Other thing that we've been doing is looking at cross-checking our laboratory measurements. We've always worried, particularly for stiffness, which is hard to measure, we've always worried that we were measuring it a bit lower than it really was, but by cross-checking across the laboratories, we were able to confirm that we both are in agreement in the properties and the stiffness values that we measure, which is reassuring. Good check. But one thing that we found with that project is that some of the adjustment equations, including some of the ones that are used in the standards and in grading settings work, might be laboratory specific. So they might be it might be specific to particular machines in the way that the machines behave. Minor differences that have potentially big differences in terms of the grading calculations. That's more of a concern for us in the research community, but it's something that we want to make sure that's correct, because potentially it can influence the safety of grading calculations. So this is the project report, or the appendix of the project report from Wood Props from NUI Galway, and I want to show you one of the summaries because I think the data is really interesting, really exciting. So one of the things that we were concerned about was that forestry, aiming for things like yield and stem form, had some inadvertent negative consequences on the key properties for grading, particularly stiffness, because stiffness is the limiting property for spruce. It's the one that's closest to the grade requirement, and also because it's the mean value that is the characteristic value. If there's a small change in the mean, that means that you have to have quite a large change in the yield to maintain the required grading properties. So we thought that there might have been a decline in stiffness and potentially also in density, although that's less concerning. But there was no way really of easily checking that. So you can look at old studies, old data, and try and compare the two. But there's a couple of problems there. One is that studies are really small compared to the differences, the statistical differences that we're looking for. So they don't ever have enough samples to get a good representative sample for your statistical analysis. And the other issue is that standards change over time, particularly for mechanical properties. So it's really difficult to compare measurements of stiffness to previous standards to measurements of stiffness to modern standards. So that was a bit tricky, but fortunately there's someone in Northern Ireland that measures a huge amount of timber every day, Balcast Timber, who were generous enough to let us look at their grading machine record. So they are operating a Microtech Viscan compact machine, and the Viscan is a dynamic MOE system with mass measurement with a scale. So you get a density value and you get a stiffness value directly from the machine. It's actually literally measuring both of those things. And they've been operating this machine for about 9 years, which means that there is about 13 million board measurements over the course of 9 years. So that's a lot of data that we can look at to look at trends in wood properties. Trends over the course of years, but also interesting to us, the short-term shifts that you get in resource quality because of differences in timber quality from stand to stand. So a really interesting data set. One of the first things that's interesting to look at is the actual distribution of density. So this is a histogram of density, and we have been assuming, we always assume really in most of the work that we do, that density is normally distributed. But you can see here that it's not quite normal. There is a slight skew, and that slight skew has some consequences for the way that we calculate or estimate the percentiles. So it's really interesting to see the real shape of these distributions and work out what the implications are for the way that we do our analysis work. And the density, by the way, is pretty much where we expected it to be from our research. So that's good news. It means we were doing the right kind of work. So the density measurements, although the shape of the distribution is a bit surprising, the actual values of density are more or less where we expected them to be. Same goes for stiffness. So the stiffness was more or less where we expected it to be. We as well assume that stiffness is normally distributed, and you can see as well that it's not quite, that's slightly skewed. The stiffness of Balcast's timber is slightly higher than we expected, but it's definitely in the ballpark of what's of what we'd measured with our previous research. Now we know from other studies that we've done that there is this quite significant variation from site to site in terms of wood density and timber quality, timber stiffness. So it's not surprising then that you would see shifts in resource quality from production shift to production shift as you process timber from different sites, different stands. The implications of that for grading are not quite known. The resource shifts are not as extreme as you get in European countries that are pulling timber in their mills from much wider catchment areas, but you still see quite a bit of, not noise, but quite a bit of variation in the timber quality over time, over the short term. So this plot is showing modulus of elasticity over the course of time. And in this particular graph, we're plotting averages or overall values per month. So the red line is the median value, and the black line is the 5th percentile. And you can see that both of those, the median and the 5th percentile, they are increasing over time. They're getting better. The conclusion that we're drawing from this is that they're not getting worse. Actually, the reason that they're getting better, I think, is down to good practice at Balcas. They're getting good at segregating the material, sending the best material to the grading line. But the data is good enough, I think, that we can conclude that there is no serious decline in wood properties from what we can see here, or no serious decline in wood stiffness. You can see that there's variation from month to month, and if you were looking at finer detail as well, you'd see variation shift to shift and even pack to pack in terms of the timber that's produced. And well, we would expect that because we know that there is this structural variation in the timber quality, and sawmills, I liken them to shuffling like magicians rather than shuffling like casinos. So when the timber goes through a sawmill, it ends up in a pack, and those pieces in the pack, they tend to come from the same trees and the same stands. So they're randomized, but they're not completely randomized. There's still some structure in that, which has implications for us when we do scientific sampling. If we just take a pack of timber, that's not necessarily representative of the full production. And if we have 100 pieces, if they're all from similar trees, or perhaps even some of them from the same tree, they're not completely random, independent board measurements, as you might expect them to be. So this short-term variation is really interesting to us as well in our scientific work. But what we were studying here is this long-term shift in resource quality. And it looks like our worries are, for this, we don't need to worry. The timber quality doesn't seem to be dropping. In fact, if anything, it seems to be improving. And we see the same picture with the density as well. It looks like the density is improving over time slightly. Again, I think this is down to good sawmill practice probably, rather than necessarily an increase in the density of the resource. Although we do know that foresters have been targeting density as a quality to increase. So it's conceivable that the timber resource has increased in density too. And there were some studies looking at older data sets, and it's easier to draw conclusions about density because the standards haven't changed so much in the way that density is measured, and it's less variable property, so smaller data sets you can draw more conclusions from. And it does look like in that previous data that there does seem to be a slight increase in the density over time as well. And this is for Irish studies, and I've looked at the UK studies that have been published as well, and I would say there's probably a similar thing in the UK data as well. It looks like over time a gradual increase in the wood density, which is good news. So these are the high priority work areas of CERT in Work Package 1. One is the properties of alternative species, and Stephen will give a presentation in this webinar about that. In a nutshell, we need to be thinking about the properties of other species because of the need to diversify the forest resource as a way of building resilience against pests and diseases and climate change, and by extension resilience of the industry as well to those risks. No one is really talking about replacing the spruce, but there will be more of a mix of different species going into the mills in future years, 10, 20, 30 years down the line. And we want to be able to prepare the industry for that by getting some early information about the wood quality, the wood properties, and the potential markets. So it will be a mixture, and this mixture is another work item that we're looking at, the potential for mixing as a minor, very minor component mixing those alternative species in with an already established and recognised grading combination. So for example, British spruce, if there are other species that are similar enough in appearance and properties and the way that they grade, we would just blend that in with the spruce, and the market wouldn't really notice, and the industry wouldn't really notice. It would be an easy way of getting those other species to market. The other thing that we've been looking at is potential for grading of Scots pine. This is a piece of work that we haven't quite started yet, but want to get onto. Not so much about improving the grading potential of Scots pine so much as being able to grade Scots pine with modern grading machines, the kind of grading machines that are being operated in mills these days. We did recently, or a couple of years back, a project, quite a large one, looking at the performance and grading of spruce battens. This was a project that we did in partnership with another project funded by the Irish industry, which was to get over a temporary issue with that came about by revision of the standards over there. It was not really welcome by the industry in either place, but the work was necessary in order for the industry to continue producing, and this is a good example actually of how an inadvertent change in the standards has some consequences for the industry. So the work has been done, the testing has been done. We need to do some work to do with the implication of the results, but essentially the UK grown spruce and Irish grown spruce tiling battens were actually a fair bit better than people expected them to be. Another thing that we've been looking at is the monitoring of the effects of tree improvement on grading. Now, I mentioned just a while ago about the work that was done with the Wood Props project, looking at the longer term trends in stiffness and density over time. But there's another piece of work that we need to do looking at the timber that's just now coming into the industry. And it's not just about the properties that it has, but the correlations between the things that we use for grading and the things that are important for grading. So for example, if we're using X-ray machines for the grading, do we have the same correlations between knots and density and strength and stiffness in this new improved material than we had in the past? And because people are getting better at this tree selection and tree breeding program, we think that there is this potential for a change. So that's something that we need to check to make sure isn't happening. There is a piece of work that we did on looking at the effects of incising on structural properties. That's another presentation coming up in this webinar. And as I mentioned in the previous presentation, the overview of the CERT project, it's not just construction products that we're interested in. We talk about it a lot because it's the one that uses most of the research effort, but we are interested in timber quality issues for non-construction products too. And so there's a work package around that. Another thing that we've not quite started yet but want to get working on is looking at the Forestry Commission decision support system. This is a planning tool that used some of the research output to make predictions about timber quality based on previous research projects that we did. And we want to make sure that these predictions are accurate. So this is a double checking of the predictions that it makes to make sure that the conclusions and the implications are reliable. And public engagement, which is something that we continue to do, educating the public about the importance of the forest and timber industries, and hopefully as well getting people to understand how they work, and even better if we get more people interested in working in the sector too. Medium priority work areas, one is an investigation in degradations in spruce trees, so defects that occur in the standing tree, how we can avoid the trees that have those defects and the trees getting the defects in the first place. And there's a presentation by Ruben from Forest Research coming up in the webinar. And dissemination and knowledge transfer is another work area. It's events like this, but also events for people outside the CERT project, particularly for engineers and architects, so that they understand the resource better, particularly the homegrown resource. We're interested as well in looking at machine-assisted visual grading. So there is a new class of grading machine which is cheap and portable, potentially usable in the smaller mills that would be at the moment using visual grading. And as well, this is something that might actually make it easier to get these alternative species to market with a combination of machine and visual grading. We still need to look at more in this secondary properties of British spruce, because that's another area where we can improve actually the designs, because often the designs are not governed by the strength and stiffness. Actually, they're governed by the secondary properties, the secondary design properties, and we think there's potential to improve the values that are used in the declaration of performance to make the timber perform better in the structural calculations. And we did a few years back the sawmiller survey alternative species, getting an idea of what sawmillers know, what their experience are of working with these other species, what they think about them, and we need to incorporate those findings back into the research that we do, especially looking at the potential for these alternative species. So there are some non-priority work areas, some of these covered by other projects. There's a lot of exciting work going on in homegrown timber and CLT production, especially by my colleague Robert Hairstands and his team. There is the issue around spruce juvenile core properties, particularly stiffness, and how that can be improved by tree breeding, and a really exciting project going on with Forest Research and Oxford University in that area. And as I mentioned, with NUI Galway, we've been looking at cross-checking our bending test measurements. It's important for us, but not necessarily a high priority for the industry at large, which is why it got assigned a non-priority in the CERT project. Other issues that we've been looking at is the potential for adaptive settings. This is a new possibility that was introduced in the revision of part 2 of EN 14081. No one quite knows how well it would work on the UK resource, but that's probably something that we will, or the ideas that we will investigate in another project called In Future Wood. And then in Future Wood, we've got a work package that's looking at how we would grade secondary timber, so timber from demolition or recycling where we don't know so much about the species and where it comes from, and we need a different approach to grading. And there's a whole other set of videos, if you're interested in that topic, that you can watch. And we had a couple of research partnerships planned with visiting researchers that have been delayed because of the pandemic. One was looking at the quality aspect in environmental impact assessment. So at the moment with environmental impact, all timber is treated the same, but that's not really how we should be thinking about it. There are availability issues to do with different supplies and different species, and they should be part of the environmental impact assessment too, because we do have a over-specification problem, and hopefully that can be fixed by thinking about the negative environmental consequences of over-specifying your timber. Another thing that we were hoping to do and didn't get round to because of this pandemic was looking at near infrared for predicting wood properties. So this is a potential rapid assessment tool, so measurements that you could make on the timber without needing to test it, another kind of non-destructive testing that potentially you can get some information about wood properties, and hopefully that will be done when people are allowed to travel again. And we did in the past quite a bit of work looking at tree and log segregation approaches, especially using acoustic tools, standing tree acoustic tools and log acoustic tools, and that's something that we want to get back into now that we know more about the science of this. So we think there's still potential for improving that process. And there are some work areas that have not been discussed yet and given a priority. One is around minor species add-on, so should we be doing additional species to the ones that we've already looked at? Should we be doing more testing on the particular species that look promising? There's some potentially useful work that we can do on looking at how to predict structural sized timber properties from small clear measurements. Small clears are a lot easier and a lot cheaper to do, and as a rapid assessment they're a lot more useful cost-effective way of screening those minor species, but at the moment we don't really know how to interpret the small clear measurement to structural size. Another thing that I want to work on is a new simplified approach to visual grading, which is aimed at maximizing yield because a lot of people want to use timber for quite simple, straightforward buildings, and they don't need the high properties. So most of the timber is perfectly adequate, but most of the grading rules will end up rejecting timber because they're aiming for higher grades than necessary for those buildings. So I think there is potential for a new simplified visual grading approach for those circumstances where we have quite simple buildings and it's just a case of that people want to use the timber and get it past the structural assessment or the structural checks for the design. Lately just added onto our list but not yet discussed by the Cert Management Board is an investigation of the blue stain prevention treatments that are available on the market, looking at how well they work. And in the last meeting we discussed the potential of looking at GoldenEye 702 grading machine data, historical data, for looking at long-term trends in wood property. So really taking that same approach that we did with the Balcas Viscan data over to X-ray grading machines too, where we get also information about knots as well as more detailed information about the density. So potentially exciting things there. So that's the summary of the grading work and the other bits and pieces that we've been doing in Work Package 1. So thanks for listening.